I've had students, and they've never heard about the allegory of the cave. You give them the allegory of the cave, and it's like scales fall from their eyes, and they now see. In addition to a lot of philosophy is to understand, but part of really understanding well is to see it in someone, to see it instantiated in some way. Plato is so good at that.
Welcome to Classical Etc. You're in the studio with Shane Saxon.
Welcome to another episode of Classical Etc. Today's episode is about philosophy and philosophy in classical education. But before we get there, if you enjoy this show, feel free to subscribe to it, give us a like, follow along with us. Now, before we get into the topic of philosophy, which we try not to fly too close to the sun on this show and get too deep into the weeds. So we're going to have some very practical elements. We are educators here, and this is philosophy in the context of education. But before we get there, I have a question for you too. I feel like I need a caveat before I say that. We did not leave Tanya,
or at least a pause,
off this episode because she doesn't like philosophy. She doesn't like philosophy.
She was just texting me about philosophy this morning, actually.
Yeah.
So
we took the opportunity to talk about it.
No, not even that. It's just she's not here. Question that I have for you: what was the last philosophy book that you read?
Would you consider Plato to Christ philosophy in some ways? Yeah, I mean he's recapping philosophy.
Well, yeah, I guess. Yeah.
But the one that comes to mind is about killed me was Truth and Method.
Oh,
by Gadamer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Martin and Mitchell and I struggled through that one together, and
which was about. So just so the audience knows, not that this is going to help any literary hermeneutics. I think maybe.
I think that's what it was supposed to be about. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
You need to be careful about reading books by Germans with long names. I found.
It's wise life advice.
Right.
Generally, my habit with philosophy has been to read with others. So there's the other one. What was the other one we were doing? Analogia Entis.
Yes.
That I don't think we finished.
The Analogy of Being.
Yes.
The translation of that.
Very good.
Yes. But again,
very hard.
Extremely. I mean, we meet with some people who. I mean, I have a philosophy degree. He's got a philosophy background because of his education. Dan Scheffler, our Memoria College professor, he's got a PhD in philosophy. So some of those kind of books, like that one in particular, can only really be read by people who have the training to read it. And those actually are not my favorite books on philosophy.
Right, they'll really kill you on philosophy.
Yeah, there's something to this clarity thing that I really like.
Yeah.
And good writing, which many philosophers don't really know how to do all that well.
Yeah, if Strunk and White are right, that the best way to say something is the simplest way with the words most commonly known to most people. That has an inverse relationship to disciplines where there are so many technical terms.
Yes.
That the word choices are very specific and laden with meaning that if you are not deeply entrenched in that particular discipline, hermeneutics, for instance, every sentence is an exercise in research. Basically.
Well, and this is why philosophy scares people, and they're justified in that, I think, because again, you have to have that training, and even in the training, a lot of the training is not very good. I went to the University of California. I got my philosophy degree there. In the very first class, you're talking about people who are coming into this fresh. They have you read Aristotle's Topics, which is one of the most, one of the hardest things, even in Aristotle. Aristotle's not easy anyway. It's one of the harder Aristotle reading. Why would you do that? Why don't you present some big picture to entering students that they can comprehend before they start getting into the weeds somewhere? This is a constant problem.
What was that book that you gave Cheryl? It was yellow. It was written by Phaser.
Oh,
Refutation of the New Atheism.
The Last Superstition, and that's now even that is going to be a little bit difficult. But he's writing journalistically, at least there.
Yeah, it's very comprehensible.
It's directed toward the average the average intelligent reader, I'll say. And it's a very good, and it's kind of polemic. So it's kind of fun because he's arguing for a position and against some other positions. That book was written when the new atheism was a thing a number of years ago. And so it's the polemic nature of it makes it a funner read, I think.
On the flip side of the highly technical nature of a lot of modern philosophical writing, the last two philosophical books that I read are one, The Tale of Sisyphus by Camus, which is difficult, but not as difficult because he's going for a very existential attempt of conveying his experience. But then also The Republic. I read through The Republic just front to back. And while it's obviously a difficult book, reading it in English translation, the commentary on The Republic is far more difficult than The Republic itself. There's a lot that actually stands out and can be helpful for the average person to read.
And that's one of the things that I learned as a student was that oftentimes you're better off, like Plato in particular, because Plato's a good writer, and he's really writing, interestingly, for a more popular audience. Really, he's writing for laymen, and I found reading Plato far easier than reading the commentaries on Plato.
Sure.
Now, there are some cases when that's not true, but it's more true than you would think, that actually reading the actual famous philosopher is easier than reading the commentaries on it.
Yeah, and I remember when I was studying philosophy, they would recommend books that were written sort of in a Platonic style or or couched in a narrative form, so that as we got into philosophy, they would show us how to pull these ideas out, and like, these are the ideas you're wrestling with. This is what philosophy's for, so that it wasn't just diving straight into the analytical and difficult.
And can I say, just in case we leave this topic and we don't get back to it, this whole how do you approach philosophy? I really do think that the books of Peter Kraft, his Socrates Meets books, he starts out with Socrates Meets Jesus, and then he then goes and he gives really a whole kind of almost history of philosophical thought through Socrates meets Kant, Socrates meets Descartes, Socrates, a whole slew of them. And when I go to tell a younger person who's wanting to get into philosophy, I say, read those Peter Kraft, Socrates Meets books. And also for modern philosophy, I strongly recommend William Barrett, who was one of the great journalistic, literary journalists of the 20th century. He wrote for the Atlantic Monthly magazine for many years, and his books, the Death of the Soul, and he wrote several others. The Irrational Man, which is the best book on existentialist philosophy, I think, that's been written. You need to find these journalistic writers who understand what they're explaining, but can say it in a way that the common person can understand.
Yeah. So switching to our main topic from, we've established that you guys are interested in philosophy. Martin, you have a philosophy degree. Paul has studied philosophy. You have a philosophy background from your what would you call it?
I was
training?
just shy of undergrad in philosophy when I decided to move back to the States from Italy.
Yeah. So, and my dad's a philosophy professor, and so I kind of inherited some interest in philosophy from him. But the question for us as educators, and the prompt for this episode really, is this: how much philosophy is good or appropriate for a high school or a K-12 kind of education? What is too little? Doesn't equip a student to navigate the world of ideas, because ideas are important. And what's too much? What is taking our interests as nerdy philosophy guys and putting it down the throats of students when it may be more than they actually need or are equipped to handle as 18-year-old students going into the world? So let me just start there with that most basic question. How much philosophy is enough in a classical Christian education?
You can include in the term philosophy like logic, right? Because that is a domain of philosophy that you need to learn to reason well in order to reason about the highest things, right? Or the most foundational things. So, and then this program that I've been working on for years, we've talked about for years, classical philosophy, that's a 1-year course, but really before they've even gotten there, that's why I've said like material logic is essential before they even get there. You've got to have, and the students actually going to be having read some of Cicero and Augustine. And so they've started to struggle with deeper ideas before they come to that classical philosophy class. So there's been preparation work done, right? So you could kind of look at it very narrowly and say, well, at Highlands, we give them a year, right? But the reality is we're doing so many things to lead up to that and to really make them ready for it. And really even the new classical history of art course that we had that conversation with Kyle recently is very much he's coming at it philosophically as well. It's not just, let's understand these time periods of art, but what of it? What does it mean about aesthetics for us to do that?
Martin, same question. How much philosophy should a student study before they're graduating from high school?
Well, I mean, that question could mean one of two things, right? It could mean how much actual learning with a philosophy label on it are we talking about, and how much are we talking about? Because philosophy works its way out, particularly in literature. And so some of the literature they would be reading will have some of this in there. And I really do think philosophy in a lot of ways is kind of a top-down thing. And so I think that younger kids specifically it's better that they learn from the bottom up than from the top down, because they haven't had a lot of experience in the world. And, you think of philosophers like Immanuel Kant, who never got out of Königsberg, Germany, ever. And yet he changed the world with his philosophy. And there's a few people like that. But mostly people need some experience in life. And it's hard enough to have that for children. And so you kind of use literature to fill some of the gaps of the things you're not actually experiencing by reading about other people who did experience those things and had relationships and had thoughts about the world. And so I think that's the better avenue to approach it from. And we it's a big job just to get that done on the K through 12 level. So I think that if you were to do actually an explicit philosophy course, I think it should probably be reserved for 11th or 12th grade, and it needs to be pretty basic, and maybe have maybe a survey, maybe take a survey approach to it. Just have them deal with some of the basic ideas, the basic problems of philosophy, just so they know what those are. And it's like a puppy. They need to chew on the toy for a while. So I do think you are somewhat limited, because philosophy takes preparation, and mostly what you're doing K through 12 is preparation.
And I mean, just to follow that train of thought, like, I think there's absolutely a world in which you do too much philosophy in a K to 12 setting, right? Like, if we say that you could make the argument that philosophical thought is sort of a culmination of classical training, right? That you've been so well trained enough that you can think about being itself, right? Not just the concrete things in front of you, but like what would be the cause of that thing and the cause of that thing, et cetera. But we're human beings, right? So we need the literature and history is bringing in the human, right? But that's also going to affect our philosophy, the way we see the world. And so I would say, I would echo Martin on that you reserve philosophy as philosophy 11th or 12th grade, and don't try to do too much.
And people don't do this anymore, but they did a lot of it when I was growing up, which is work on cars. Nobody works on cars anymore. You got to take them in now because they're all computerized and componentized. But you first learn how to drive the car, right. And then when if you want to look under the hood to see how it works, that's great. But first you got to learn how to drive the car. And once you learn how to drive the car and what a car is for and the things that it does, then you can look under the hood and see how all that is able to happen and fix it if you need to. And so I think that, just metaphorically, I think we need a good metaphor to look at this.
In your analogy,
that's the one I'm throwing out.
Philosophy is the motor.
Philosophy is the motor, but literature, Latin, traditional logic, these are learning to drive the car.
Right.
Yeah. So hypothetical question here. Imagine you're a person given the argument you guys have made that the study of some philosophy is important. So imagine you're a person who is committed to writing a philosophy course for Memoria Press and you haven't completed it. Is that justifiable, or is there no excuse for that? Paul, question goes to you.
I live in a human world, in which there's a finite amount of time. And in that finite amount of time, there's a finite amount of things you can do. If you study philosophy, you might know that, Shane.
What is this, Zeno Zero? I think Aristotle has an answer for you, but I'll let it slide.
Yeah, potentially, it's all there.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? It just hasn't been actualized yet. So, it's coming. It's coming. We're taping instructional videos, finishing up the books. It'll be here soon.
So as you were writing this course, as you were thinking about it, you were trying to prepare that 1 year of philosophy, capital P, that our students would actually be studying. What was it important that the students get into if we're going to dedicate a year to philosophy?
There were two things. I wanted a basic understanding of Plato and Aristotle, but fundamentally, I wanted them to learn how to make distinctions. And if you can do that in a philosophical arena, right, you can think through anything. So to me, that year of philosophy, it is getting them content, right? Hopefully they've learned the 4 causes of material logic, but they're going to understand how important that is once they've gone through that year of philosophy. We're going to, spend a lot of time in Boethius and seeing how philosophy gets worked out in the Christian world and Aquinas. There's a whole lot that they learn. But to me, the way that course has to be taught, where students, the videos we're making for it are different than our normal ones. We've got a lecture piece and a conversation piece because you have to struggle with it, right? I can sit in front and have of a group of students and have them regurgitate ideas back to me, but that's not helpful, right? Because when we're saying reserve this for 11th or 12th grade, this is where these ideas are getting solidified in their heads, where it's becoming part of them. It's something that they're going to take with them. And so just that struggle, right? I mean, I had students come up to me after I taught the course and say, I was dealing with, another child and another student in the Governor Scholars Program who said they couldn't believe in God because, an all-powerful God means there's no free will. And I want to live in a world with free will. And she's like, go read Boethius. He gives you the answer to that, right? Like, she could explain it to him, but it was something where she was so confident because she had struggled with it over a period of several weeks going through that work that she could defend it. Now, I mean, it's easier to say, go read the book, but I mean, if they'd had the book, she would have said, look, here's the arguments, right? And I believe those arguments because I've tried to fight against them and they win, right? And so for me, I mean, there's a whole lot of content that they get insofar as an understanding of Platonism and Aristotelianism and how that works out. But it's really, for me, the massive thing that I think they take out of it is an ability to reason through abstract concepts.
And then just to encounter some of the great problems, and this is why, Plato is such, I think, a good starting point in so many ways for a student, is because, Alfred North Whitehead said that, all philosophy is a footnote to Plato. And he's the one who kind of charts the course for the rest of philosophy ever after. And there's that.
Meaning Plato, not Alfred North.
Plato. Plato is, So, and then the way he explains something is very concrete, which is what you need. He will give an example of something. He's discussing what is justice. And so he articulates the allegory of the cave. It's a story. He will tell you a story. And I think this is, that is the best way to teach, is through illustration. And so Plato does that very well. And, I've had students and they've never heard about the allegory of the cave. You give them the allegory of the cave and it's like scales fall from their eyes. And they now see, in addition to a lot of philosophy is to understand, but part of really understanding well is to see it in someone, to see it instantiated in someone. Plato is so good at that, which is why I think really pedagogically Plato's Plato's always a good place to start.
It's a similar question to Paul, but maybe broader. You wrote this article, Classical Education and the Cosmic Order, and seem to be arguing, this is published in Artis Librorum, you said.
Mhm.
So published there, and you seem to be arguing that there is something that classical education does philosophically that's helpful for people today. Could you kind of get into that? What are the assumptions of classical education and how they interact with today, philosophical assumptions that many people have today, consciously or subconsciously?
Well, I think that one of the things that you hear a lot about in discussions of classical education is what's called the transcendentals. The ancient philosophers talked about this, and those original transcendentals were five. There were five of them. There was the true, the good, the beautiful, unity, I think, and being, or I think I have that right. But we talk a lot about the good, the true, and the beautiful. Those are three of the original five transcendentals. The movement now understands that what it is doing is trying to articulate those three things and how they manifest themselves in the world. And I think that we're the only people really talking a lot about that. Those used to be things people actually talked about, and they don't really talk about that anymore in a popular way. And so I think we're just, all the things that we do and all the programs that we have and in all the different subjects, that ultimately we're trying to get to those three things. And, Plato says, I think it's in the Republic, where he says that if you take the trajectory of the true and you draw a line where that's going, and the good and the beautiful, that all those things, three things, meet in God. And so I think in a Christian education system, this is very appropriate. This approach is very appropriate to that.
Well, and I think you'd be surprised how many kids go through a classical program, and at the end, if you ask them to enunciate maybe what does it mean that something's true, what does it mean that something's good, what does it mean that something's beautiful, you will still get, because society is pervasive, you will still get pop culture answers if they haven't gone through some sort of systematic year where we've made all of that clear, right? And so even though we have maybe worked on forming their appetites insofar far as what they perceive as beautiful, right? That there is harmony, that there's proportion, that, all these sorts of things, they'll still tell you that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? Instead of the fact that there is harmony, there is proportion that we can point to. And, same thing with the good and the true. And so it's important for us to, I think, really clearly lay that out and wrestle with that so that they can then look at the world they live in critically and evaluate it in the light of what it really means, what those transcendentals really mean.
Yeah, because the chief modern problem with those three issues, the good, the true, and the beautiful, is they've all been, as Paul says, relativized. Aesthetics, beauty goes first. That beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Then morality becomes relativized. It's what's good for you. It's what's good for you. It's good for me. It's what's good for me. And then finally, in the 20th century, it's truth itself has become relativized. Something can be true for you and only you, and true for me, and that may be completely different. But there's no common thing above both of us that we can say is the true. And so I think part of the inoculation we have to provide students in classical education is an understanding that those things are objective, and that all this talk about these things being relativized is doesn't make any sense. And people don't really believe it when it comes right down to it. People will talk moral relativism, but when somebody steals their wallet, they all of a sudden become an objectivist. So the people, it's not a livable. The modern view of these things is not a livable philosophy. I also wrote an article called "What is the Christian Worldview," where I talk about this, and one of the reasons I wrote this article, "Classical Education and the Cosmic Order," is because I'm proposing that this term worldview, it has this relativist ring to it. It's from the German Weltanschauung, and it means world picture or world. It sounds very subjective. Your worldview. That sounds very relativist to me anyway, and I think to a lot of other people. And I proposed replacing it with the word cosmology, the study of reality.
Right.
And to me, that just seems like a lot less subjective term. I probably will not succeed in getting anyone to agree with me, but
I support Martin. You have my vote. But the one thing I was going to bring up, because you asked that question about this course, which is not yet finished, the fundamental question that we ask there is, what is the first cause? And so Martin talking about how, with Plato, with the true, the good, and the beautiful, they all end in God. That's where we're going to end up. But we get there by asking questions about reality, and where fundamentally we have to come to a first cause, and that first cause being God. So it's a, but then you end up in something which is outside of you, that you have to submit to, you have to subject yourself to, and say, okay, that is something bigger than me. It's not, I don't get to define my own truth. And so that's in that course, that's the fundamental question through the whole year.
You both have been talking up to a subject that in my upbringing would have been called apologetics. They would say every high schooler needs to take some apologetics so they're equipped to face the world. At Highland Zion School, we have an apologetics metaphysics year. Do you think that philosophy addresses that apologetic concern, or why do we use the word philosophy? Why do we spend a whole year on philosophy rather than a whole year on apologetics?
Well, we actually spend a whole year on philosophy, which is fundamentally could be called apologetics, because you end up with a knowledge of that God exists, right? But the next year where we study classical art, the history of art, they also spend a semester doing apologetics proper, if you will. But that year of philosophy has given them foundational tools. I grew up always being told that philosophy is the handmaiden of theology, right? And so if you've got those philosophical tools, then you're actually able to do much more apologetically, because you've got that foundation to stand on.
Yeah, and I think that I think that apologetics assumes a knowledge of philosophy, because if it's not, then all you've got is techniques for argumentation. I mean, that's the difference. Plato would have called it the difference between sophistry and philosophy. You can learn how to argue really well, but if you really don't understand the issues all that well, then maybe you might win an argument, but have you really brought anyone to truth?
And maybe we ought to make a distinction between apologetics that fundamentally based sort of on interpretation of the Bible, and apologetics that is, would be directed towards a non-Christian, right? And so I think the way Martin and I are using apologetics is towards a non-Christian, which is saying, okay, fundamentally, how do we defend the fundamental things of the faith, meaning that God exists, that God. What does it mean that God became man? What does it mean that there's a Trinity? Things that we're all Christians are going to accept, but that we're going to, in the conversations we're going to have with non-Christians, that stuff's going to kind of come
and that's part of the thing is in apologetics, when you're actually dealing with people, most people have not thought about deeper issues very much. And when it starts coming down to whether your faith is true, you're getting into those deeper issues, and you can start asking them questions about things. Well, do you think that this is just all here by accident? What's your view on this? And they realize they haven't really thought this through very well. And if you've got a philosophical background, you can guide them a little bit, and just guiding them towards truth, just truth in general, is really the first apologetic step anyway. Mm-hmm. and people all of a sudden realize, oh gosh, there's more to this than I thought.
And that if there's a truth outside me, then I have to conform to it.
Right.
Reading Cicero's On the Gods. That's the one that they read in high school here. I believe.
The Nature of the Gods.
The Nature of the Gods.
Yeah.
It's interesting looking at the various arguments that Cicero is responding to, which are, from the skeptics that are like, is there a God? Is morality relative? It's all the same exact conversations in a totally non-Christian context where they're applying their mind and arguments to it. It's interesting. And I think
really, the first goal in apologetics is convincing people that reality exists. I mean, fundamentally, and then you start defining what that reality is.
Right. Well, and that book, On the Nature of the Gods, that was one book that Cheryl did not want cut out of this course. Because she felt it was important for children today to deal with the Epicureans and the Stoics, because we have so many Epicureans today. And the push and pull of the Epicureans and Stoics is instructive.
Yeah. Okay, let's end the podcast on this. An adult listener who maybe wants to read a little bit more philosophy. Where do they start? It's such a big topic. Where are the handholds? How do you get into this conversation, into the great conversation about ideas?
I'd go back to the last superstition, honestly, because for an adult listener who's Christian, who like that an apologetic would capture them more than just pure philosophy, and it is polemical, but you walk out with a fundamental understanding of philosophical realism, which is coming out of Plato and Aristotle, and I just found it such an enjoyable read.
I think that's a good suggestion. A number of years ago, I was going out with a friend of mine to lunch who was a salesman at a local radio station, and he looked in the back and he saw I had the book Socrates Meets Jesus by Peter Kraft. He said, "Could I borrow that?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." So 2 weeks later, he calls me back. He says, "That's the best book I've ever read." It just opened his eyes. He said, "Can I give it to my one of the DJs?" I said, "Sure." And the DJ proceeded to lose the book, and it was out of print, and I didn't see it again for a number of years. And finally, an University Press brought it back into print. I agree with Paul. I think maybe Socrates Meets Jesus is a more simpler read, and then read that. But I would strongly recommend Socrates Meets Jesus by Peter Kraft.
I would recommend anything in the Platonic dialogues.
But I'm glad you brought that up,
because they're actually much easier to read than you would think, and there's great storytelling. And Socrates' Apology is a really interesting read, especially for a Christian.
And a lot of philosophy programs will start in the Apology as well. Yeah, that's a great one. But you're right; they're very readable.
Very readable.
Like nobody should start with Aristotle.
No.
Right. You should start with Plato. If you're going to go read a primary source, Plato's a very good place to start.
Yeah. Well, hopefully there are some people who like philosophy who have listened to this point. And for all of you, I thank you. And thank you all for having this conversation. We'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of Classical Etc. If you enjoyed this conversation, please consider liking this video. If you want to join the conversation, then you can comment below. And if you want to stay connected, please subscribe to our channel. I hope you enjoyed this show, and we'll see you next time.